Our next speaker now, which is Jim Tucker. Jim is Head of Journalism down at Whitireia Journalism School down in Wellington. And I had the pleasure of catching up with Jim last week and being shown around, and it's a very impressive modern campus. So yes, without further ado, welcome Jim.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I've had to put the pencil through some of what I've written after hearing some of the things that Jane has said. For instance, I had this very well-founded theory that if you could reenact a suicide on a soap opera on television, that would have much more potential for harm than, my words here are, the second and third-hand accounts of officials and those known to a suicide victim. But she's just proven it wrong, so that's been excised. Tēnā koe, George, thank you for your welcome. And I acknowledge some of my colleagues from the media, John Rowan from the Herald down here, Jonathan Marshall from Sunday News, Jenny McIntyre. Shane Curry was on the list. Is Shane here from the Sunday Herald? Given the events of the weekend, which have involved the news media in some difficult legal decision-making, today's forum is pretty timely. In the case I'm referring to so obliquely, questions arise over coverage of failed suicide bids, presumably not covered by the Coroner's Act, reporting the activities of celebrities, contempt of court, given that the person involved in this faces an impending trial, and a relatively new legal remedy that he and his family may have available to them, the tort of privacy. This was only recognised by the Court of Appeal in 2003 in the Mike Hosking versus New Idea case. Remember, Mike tried to stop pictures of his kids appearing in the magazine. He failed, but the judges recognised that the tort of privacy, which is a tort, gives you the legal right, one person A to sue person B for damages. And it's undeveloped in New Zealand, so I'm not sure whether it applies in this case or not, but it might do. So it'll be interesting to see whether Sunday News cops it or not. Read my blog, there's more on it. Okay, if you turned up today in the hope of hearing something relatively rare in this country, a journalist breaking ranks and dissing his own profession, I use the word profession in quotes, and those who purport to be its guardians and spokespeople, then I'll probably disappoint you. You've read the synopsis of what I was going to say. Due to the demands of the printer, that was written before I'd written this paper or done any research or had a chance to position my thinking. I'm not an expert in this area. What was expressed in the preview came from something that happened once a year in my hometown, New Plymouth, when I taught journalism there for 5 years. We had a thing called Death Week. It was an idea borrowed from the Australians. I went to a conference there and I thought I heard a journalism educator mention Death Week. In fact, it was only Death Day, but I found in our course there were so many times when we were dealing with the coverage of trauma, homicides and road crashes and ghastly things. So we aggregated that into a week. And one of our best speakers was the local coroner, someone who's long since disappeared under the new system. He was a bit of a renegade, this guy, and he was a very, very straight talker, and he ran to his own rules, basically, and they were not legally correct, but he didn't care. And he said if the local paper, who complained all the time, wanted to do anything about it, they could go to the judiciary, but he knew damn well they wouldn't because it was too expensive, and they didn't. But what he said, the phrase that resonates still with me is suicide is nobody else's business. And his rule was, even though the law said that he should allow the name and the fact that death was self-inflicted to be published, he said no. And he might make an exception if it was a local celebrity, but that was a big might. The 2006 Act has tidied all this up. We now have professional or full-time coroners, and I presume now they're all kept in line by the chief coroner. But in those days, the coroners were a law unto themselves, so you've got a great variation around the country. In his view, the family and associates, anyone who so I've used that word commit, suicides. We have to have a verb in there somewhere. I don't like turning nouns into verbs, I'm sorry. So commit suicide, suffer enough grief without having it played out in the news media. So where I stray from the media party line on reporting suicide is that I think he was right. I haven't had any personal family brushes with suicide that inform that stance. It's just my view as a human being who happens to be a journalist. They are human beings, believe me, teachers and media, and as a teacher and media commentator. I found it interesting, by the way, that very few people have considered what this does to journalists. But I think in Australia there's the Dart Institute is doing a lot of work about the trauma that journalists face. I mean, we are seen to be inhuman, possibly because of the things that we do. So I won't, for what I'm saying today, I won't get any thanks from the Commonwealth Press Union News Media Freedom Committee, because we're all aware that the committee, which acts on behalf of newspapers, radio, TV, magazines, has been campaigning for a relaxation of the suicide reporting rules. And people like me are expected to sort of fall into line with that, because it does seem on the surface to be a reasonable case for an extension of freedom of expression. But I break the rules, partly for the reason given above, and I'll explain the other reasons. But I'd first like to look at what led to this standoff between the Ministry of Health and the news media industry. It's obviously a lot more relaxed today because of the work that people like Spins are doing, but there is a standoff situation there, believe me. Prior to 1998, the matter of suicide coverage by the media was settled and little debated within the industry, as far as I'm aware. The informal self-regulating benchmark was set in the late 70s by a couple of Press Council decisions against, oddly enough, Sunday News. The Council upheld complaints about the paper's lurid suicide stories. To the best of my knowledge and experience, these became the convention for any subsequent coverage by any kind of media, and we've used them ever since in journalism school when we teach this to students. Basically, it's report the name and that death was self-inflicted and nothing more, if you're allowed to do that by your local coroner. What happened in 1998 was unfortunately typical of the way some government bureaucrats regard the news media. My wife is one, and I know this personally. She regards me with great suspicion. The Ministry of Health issued a report which set out the way journalists should thenceforth report suicide. Its mistake, unfortunately, was not consulting the news media itself, which is tantamount to standing on a melting ice floe and poking a starving polar bear with a small stick. At that time, the Newspaper Publishers Association Chief Executive, Phil O'Reilly, he's the man who now pops up for Business New Zealand ubiquitously, a man, I would say, who's not far short of a polar bear in stature and probably equal in terms of reaction time. He headed up what could only really be called a retaliatory campaign that not only attacked the ministry for its discourtesy, but set about refuting its case for tighter media controls, which is what they were seen as. I think they were really just guidelines, but the media is very sensitive when someone treads on this sacred thing called press freedom. A measure of refutation wasn't hard to achieve. The ministry's position seemed, from the papers that I've been provided for this, to prepare for this, to rely on overseas research about media effects and how these might apply here. And I guess you could say that such an approach is inevitably speculative. Our news media landscape is different in subtle ways. I mean, we have traditionally been 10 years behind the rest of the world. It's probably only about 10 weeks now with the web. The impact of a less restrictive reporting regime might vary from overseas experience. When this debate was played out before Parliament, Jim Anderton and his colleagues took the conservative stance that while local research is not abundant, or on media effects even existing, overseas experience gave enough of a guide to suggest doing nothing is the safer course. In the face of evidence either way, that seems sensible. And we certainly heard that from Jane today. The evidence is pretty plain. But I think the ministry appears to have made some mistakes. One, I think, is that in the papers that I read, it applies the word media indiscriminately, whereas the news media is a separate sector from those which use fiction, such as TV drama and film. And we saw some distinction made there in Jane's presentation. And I crossed out the next bit because I had the theory, as I said. Anyway, TV and film drama is also more likely to be seen by that sector of the media audience considered most at risk, young people. The ministry seems to ignore the rapid decline of traditional, quotes, mainstream news media consumption among those aged 30 and below, most of whom now get their information from the web and their entertainment from DVDs, movies and TV drama, although that bit probably hasn't changed much. I know that whenever I start a journalism course, I know in my heart that 95% of my students have lied to me when I interviewed them, when I said, do you read newspapers? And it's a complete novelty when we present them with a copy of the Dominion Post every day to go through. They're quickly hooked in, but they don't. Young people don't read newspapers. And I think that is not reflected in the papers that I read. The papers seem to be locked into the traditional media, news media area. So what I'm saying is that the ministry appears to have paid little heed to the biggest paradigm shift in the media since television appeared in the 50s. And that's the growth of the internet and social networks. Those in writing and researching before 2000 could be excused for ignoring the latter, since social networks are a recent development. But it seems inadequate for the debate to be held without up-to-date data on this new branch of the media and the news media, the web. And I was very interested to hear what Anil showed us, we'll see that today, the incredible impact of your website. That's a real clue to us, isn't it? That this is where we need to be taking a real hard look. Now, the ministry appears to be saying that it's done little or no research on the New Zealand news media scene in relation to suicide effects. And until today, I was unaware of any intentions to correct this. But talking to Brian, he's going to tell you that they've started a major research project. So I won't take the wind out of your sails there. But what I would say is the work is overdue. And it needs to regard the news media as a fairly complex animal whose impacts are felt at many levels of society. A lot of this kind of research is done on the mainstream, metropolitan newspapers, a few regional dailies, the main television channels. But I would urge Brian and his colleagues to make sure they're looking at community newspapers. There's zillions of them around the country, and they are still doing well with the audience. Ethnic media outlets like iwi radio stations, there's 22 of those. There's 2 Pacific radio stations. There's Maori television now, which is having a major impact. Pay television, online news websites, and of course social networks like Facebook and Bebo. And a strange thing called Twitter. Anyone in the room, Twitter? Twitter is now the way that most news is broken worldwide. The Chinese earthquake was first heard of via someone under a desk somewhere as the building was crashing around them, twittering to their network. It's sort of like text messages sent out to a network. And it strikes me that these are things that the young people are into, and the research needs to include that. Now, what about my friends in the news media? How have they contributed to the debate? Well, very defensively. No primary research on the effects in New Zealand has been commissioned by the Media Freedom Committee, so far as I can see. They had Jim Tully do a fairly limited review, no more than a literature review from what I could see. The limited examinations I've seen have really concentrated on trying to discredit overseas research used by the ministry's consultants and researchers. Well, a pretty big task for what we saw today. And the result's pretty pallid. Someone picked up the fact that in a paper a researcher had misspelled causal as casual and was hugely excited about that. But frankly, I don't see that it was a fatal blow to the credibility of the paper. The news media industry as a whole in this country does little, if any, primary research on anything. They do. Individual media companies do a lot of commercial research on readership and sales and stuff, but you never get to see that. So I'm not aware that they do any research on media effects, and they're not interested. It's too expensive. So if they want to challenge the ministry's position, frankly, they need to spend some money and do some research. I have a little bit of a problem with researching this topic, though, because we have such a restrictive regime. How can we really tell what the effects are if there is no, in effect, news reporting of suicide, other than name and the fact that it was self-inflicted? So I'm not quite sure how you're going to gauge that, Brian. I'm sure you'll explain, but it strikes me as a kind of catch-22. There have been some other problems with the press, the news media's response. The Press Council said that something had to be done about this because of the increasing problem, especially for young people. It's a false premise. If you look at the figures, they're all coming down. So I don't know where the hell they got that from. I was going to go into the Media Freedoms Committee's campaign to open the family courts, which ended up being absolutely useless because they can get into the family court. You can get into the family court as a journalist now, but you can't report any names or any identifying factors. So nobody goes, and the only coverage you get is a documentary or in-depth sort of coverage. So if they got a little bit more out of the courts, I'm just not sure that it's going to make much difference. However, I don't know. That's just a speculation. Okay, I'm running out of time. I'm going to put this up on my blog, so if you want to read it all, that's fine. And I'll skip over. The final point, I think, is the way that the media approaches ethical issues generally. It tends to be utilitarian, the greatest happiness to the greatest number. They tend to forget the rider to that is you shouldn't be doing any harm to people. And I was reminded of how all this works when I went back into the Sunday Star Times newsroom for 6 months a couple of years ago, and hadn't written in anger for about 20 years. I thought it was time to go back, and I just realised after 20 years of teaching ethics in the classroom how easy it is to resolve ethical issues in the classroom compared to a stress situation such as the one that Jonathan works in, where you've got one of the most highly competitive markets is the Sundays, and all of my high moral ground occupation disappeared almost instantly, and I was urging people to do things that were possibly questionable. I have seen what happens when you do. You can get a strange situation with some stories. We had a case when I was in Taranaki of a very prominent family. Their son committed suicide in Sydney. He was a prominent rugby player, and because it happened in Australia, of course, they weren't covered by the same rules. The NZ Herald got into this in an incredibly insensitive and speculative way, and the family felt very battered and resentful. The local newspaper treated it with real sensitivity, didn't back off the story, it was on the front page, reported that death was self-inflicted, and the family was very grateful. And I used that case when I was in Taranaki. We brought in that reporter and the uncle, the spokesman for the family, to talk to us, so our students could see what the impacts of that were. So I have to speculate, if we liberalise the regime as the media want, it's a safe bet that someone is going to push the rules to the limit in the name of media freedom and utilitarianism, and it'll just be bad luck for any individuals caught up in the gears. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I've been looking forward with somewhat anticipation. I'm wondering what Jim was going to talk about today, but it's been fantastic. I've taken a few points from that myself. So thank you for that. We can take one or two questions, but remembering we've got the forum. Any questions? We'll save it till then. Great.